Okay, so welcome to this talk about the interpretation of textures in magmatic liquid sulfide ore genesis. So I'm hoping this will be following on from a general introduction to magmatic sulfide ores, so you've got an idea what I'm talking about. We'll go straight in. So let's just start out by recapping some of the processes that are involved in forming magmatic sulfide ore deposits. The essential of the process is that we need some sort of magma transport. We've got a magma flowing through some sort of a conduit. It might be a lava flow. It might be a subvolcanic intrusion. It could be any one of a number of things. But the important thing is that magma is carrying with it sulfide liquid droplets. And those sulfide liquid droplets, in most cases, are going to be formed by assimilation of sulfide-rich wall rocks, and you'd have heard about that in the previous lecture. Then those sulfide droplets mix with the magma, and they scavenge the metals. And then we get to the bit which is really what we're going to be talking about in this lecture, and that's the process by which we're actually extracting the sulfide from the magma to form the deposit. The evidence for that process is in the ores themselves. So this lecture is really about looking at the ore textures and understanding how we can infer from them some of the processes that are involved in actually making the ore deposit in the first place. But the other thing that we know now from researching these things over the last few years is that segregating out the sulfides and accumulating is not the end of the story. We also get a lot of processes that happen subsequent to that, and these are to do with the particular physical properties of sulfide liquids. So that's really what this next set of slides is going to be all about. So we're going to start out by looking at disseminated ores and komatiites and other types, and looking at some of the textures that we find in those. We're going to talk a bit about net textured ores. We're going to talk about some of the physical processes that control the textures that we see in the ores, and this is particularly to do with surface tension, capillary effect, sulfide silicate wetting. Then we're going to have a look at a few other examples that illustrate these kinds of processes, particularly Spinifex ores. Then we'll go to talking about massive ores, talk about emulsion textures, melt infiltration fronts, sulfide matrix ore breccias. You'll hear what all of those things mean as we go along. And then I'll finish it up with a case study of one particularly interesting deposit, the Nova deposit in Western Australia, which actually exemplifies all of these different things that we're talking about here. So moving on. So one of the remarkable things about magmatic sulfide deposits is they have such a wide variety of different textures in them, and some of those are shown on this slide. I'm not going to start discussing them yet. We'll go through them one by one, but the point of this slide is just to show how much variability there is in the kind of textures that we see in the ores. Every one of these textures has a story to tell about how the ore deposit formed and what the concentration mechanism was and what happened to the sulfides after they accumulated. And what's underpinning all of this is the basic physics of how sulfide liquids behave. There are a couple of really essential properties. One of them is that sulfide liquids are very dense. They have densities typically around about 4 times that of water, or about maybe 1.5 times that of the rocks, or the magmas that they're associated with. They're very, very low viscosity. So they have viscosities somewhere of the order of that of water. So they're extremely runny. And that also depends on the temperature. The hotter they are, the more runny they are. They also have a very high heat capacity. And a combination of all of those things means that sulfide liquids are very, very efficient carriers of heat. They're like super hot jam. And a consequence of that, as we'll see, and a theme that we're kind of running through all of these slides, is that when we put sulfides into silicate rocks, they've got the potential to act like hot knives through butter, and that has some really interesting consequences. So we're going to start by talking about disseminated ores. Disseminated ores, that just means we've got a few percent sulfide in the rock, may or may not actually be mineable. Often they're just the low-grade halos around the ore deposits. But they have some very interesting physical properties. And you're going to be seeing a few of these kinds of images. This is a micro-CT image of a disseminated lump of disseminated sulfide ore from a komatiite in Western Australia. And these brown things you can see here in the hand sample, and these orange things that you can see here in the 3D image are sulfide droplets. And these things are droplets of sulfide liquid that accumulated along with silicate crystals, usually olivine, in the rock. It's been a real kind of revolution looking at these things in 3D to see what they can actually tell us. Looking at these things is that the morphology of the sulfide droplets, or the now solidified sulfide droplets that we find in the rock, depends a lot on what proportion of crystals to silicate liquid to sulfide liquid there was in the rock at the time that it actually accumulated. And here's an example of two different textures. The one on the left is what we call an adcumulate, the one on the right is an orthocumulate. Now, an adcumulate is a rock which forms just purely by accumulation of crystals, and in this case sulfide liquid as well, but none of the original silicate liquid is left behind in the rock. So all we've got there is just olivine crystals and sulfide liquids, no liquid. That's the adcumulate. On the right hand side, the orthocumulate, we've got their sulfides, and sulfides shown there in red. The olivine crystals are in green. It's a sort of a kind of open framework of olivine crystals, and the grey stuff there is the original silicate liquid, it's komatiite liquid in this case, that was left behind in the rock after it was basically kind of sealed off from any more reaction with the magma. So the rock on the left is just pure olivine and sulfide. The rock on the right started out as olivine, sulfide, and liquid. And if we look at the textures in 3D, we see that they're actually quite a lot different. So this is first of all is the adcumulate. And that's a 3D image there showing with the shape of the sulfide, shape and size of the sulfide droplets. And you'll see that they're actually forming a sort of a 3D framework. They're forming little kind of tubes, and those little tubes of sulfide are actually running down the triple point boundaries where the olivine grains are in contact with one another. So that they're kind of occupying the grain boundaries where you've got multiple olivine grains in contact. And interestingly, what they're not doing is they're not actually covering the faces of the olivine crystals. They're just forming little tubes running down the boundaries in between them. So that's what we see in the adcumulates. Now we'll go to, this is now an orthocumulate. And the things you can see here, these are the sulfide globules, and the black stuff there are the olivine crystals. And if we look at that in 3D, we see that now actually these look quite a lot different. The sulfide's now showing up in these yellow shapes, and you can see that actually they're spherical or sort of subspherical or blobby kind of lumps of sulfide, which are not interconnected with one another. And if you look really closely, you'll see that the smaller they are, the more spherical they are. So you see there's a few of them in here. These little tiny ones are actually almost perfectly spherical in shape. And what you're seeing there is the effect of surface tension. So let's just have a look now at a little bit of theory, and we'll come back to the rocks in a minute. But just this is a little bit of sort of basic theory that is kind of going to guide us through what's to come. And the critical factor here is a wetting angle. So these diagrams show you three components: the olivines in green, the sulfide liquid's in red, and the silicate liquid is in blue. And the wetting angle determines what that interface right there looks like. If the wetting angle is very low, what that means is that the sulfide liquid likes to be in contact with the olivine. It'll tend to coat the surface of the olivine grains, and it'll have a very fine angle there at that triple point where all those three phases meet. If on the other hand the wetting angle is high, that means that the sulfide doesn't like to wet the olivine. You get a high wetting angle there, and what's going to happen in this case is that the sulfide will tend to form little beads. So you can kind of think of this a little bit like if you drop water onto a greasy frying pan, then the water doesn't want to wet the frying pan because it's got a film of grease on it, so it'll just form little balls. But if you put detergent in, then what that does is it acts to change the surface tension between the oil and the water and the frying pan, and it means that the water will now cut through the grease and cut the frying pan, and you can get the grease off. So it's essentially exactly the same kind of physics that we're seeing here, where we're looking at two different liquids, one solid surface, and looking at how they actually interact with one another. And we can predict what we would expect to see in different circumstances. So if the sulfide likes to wet the olivine, the wetting angle is low, so sulfide is wetting, then what you'd expect to happen is that the sulfide will coat the olivine grains. You'll get textures that will look like this. And in that case, if you've got all of these phases together, the sulfide will just happily run in between the olivine crystals, and sulfide will be able to migrate freely through the pore space between the olivine grains. On the other hand, if the sulfide doesn't like to wet the olivine, then what it'll tend to do is form little beads, form little droplets, and it'll get stranded in the pore space in between the olivine crystals. So now if we go back and look at what we actually saw in the rocks, what we found the observed situation is on the right. If there's silicate melt in the rock, then the sulfide forms these little blobs and spherical droplets, get stuck in between the olivine pores, and it gives rise to the texture that we saw in the orthocumulates. Now, in the adcumulate case, we saw a little bit more of this, but mostly you remember that the sulfide was actually just traveling down the boundaries where you had multiple olivine grains in contact. So what effectively is happening, what this is telling us, is that the sulfide melt doesn't wet the olivine if there's silicate melt present. If there's no silicate melt present, then the sulfide can wet the olivine. So just bear that in mind, that important distinction. The sulfide melt doesn't want to touch the olivine if there's silicate melt there, because the silicate melt likes to coat the olivine. It's like the oil on the frying pan. But if there's no oil on the frying pan, there's no silicate melt there, then the sulfide melt will happily wet the surface of the olivine. And it turns out that actually governs a lot of the textures that we see. So that's a little bit of the theory. So now let's go back and look again at the rocks. And I'm showing you here 3 different types of sulfide. This diagram on the left here is from a very, very old paper on the Cambalda ore deposits. You'll have heard a little bit about those, the classic case study of sulfides in komatiite flows. And what we find in that setting is, I'll just explain this column first. So the bottom down here, these are the rocks underneath the ore body. So these are basalts in the case of Cambalda. The red stuff here is massive sulfide, and that's what it looks like this. So that's just basically pure sulfide liquid. It's now solidified to pyrrhotite and pentlandite, but that was originally just pure sulfide liquid with no silicate there at all. Now sitting on top of that sulfide liquid, we get a zone that looks like this, and this is a zone of what's called net textured ore. And net textured ore basically consists of olivine crystals. These are the black things here. They're altered now, but they were originally olivine crystals, and they're all sitting forming this nice touching 3-dimensional framework, completely surrounded and completely enclosed in sulfide. So there's no residue of the silicate melt at all in this rock. All we've got is sulfide and olivine. Now, if we go up above that, we get into the disseminated zone. And here, this is where we get little droplets of disseminated sulfide. And again, the actual texture that we see here, as I showed you just now, depends on how much of the silicate melt is left behind. But what I want to focus on now are these net textured ores. Just blow them up in a little bit more detail so you can see the sulfide is forming a complete network around the olivines. That's why they're called net textures. And now let's have a look at one of those in a little bit more detail. And I'm going to take you to a very famous locality called Alexo. This is in Canada in the Abitibi belt. These are 2.7 billion year old komatiites, almost exactly the same age as the ones we have in Western Australia. And they've got some very nice ore deposits in them. This is a cross section through the Alexo ore body. This is the footwall rocks. This is an andesite which sits underneath it. The black stuff here is massive sulfide. The dotty stuff here with a little circular symbol, that's net textured sulfide, and then sitting above it is the komatiite flow with a little bit of disseminated sulfide in it. So now let's have a look at what the net textured ore looks like. This is a very spectacular polished slab of net textured ore. And here you can see there's a few different features in this. Most of what you're seeing here, these little black things, these little black sort of lath-like shapes in here are olivine crystals. These things here are little globules of sulfide liquid. And when I first looked at this rock, I assumed that what we were seeing here was typical net textured ore. This was just olivine and sulfide and there's nothing else. But here I'm going to show you the results of a technique that we've been applying quite a lot to these rocks. You'll see a lot of this. And this is microbeam XRF mapping. And what we do here is to take a slab of the rock, we put it under an XRF beam, and we basically measure the composition of every little micro area of this rock and build up a chemical map. So this particular map here, this is about 2 by 3 centimeters, and the different colors are a measure of the proportions of these different elements, in this case aluminium, calcium and silica. And you can use the colors that this generates to tell you what minerals are there. So it gives you like a sort of a big kind of thin section where it's really easy to see what minerals which. And on the left-hand side here, this is the 3-element map, and on here you can see the olivine is colored blue in this particular combination of colors. The sulfide comes up black, and then you get a couple of other things showing up here in these sort of greeny and pinky colors, these are in fact this pinky stuff is actually mineral chlorite, and that is actually representing the original trapped silicate melt in this rock. So over on this side, I've translated that into an image of the actual silicate components, silicate and sulfide components. Sulfide's in red now, the olivine's now in green, and all this grey stuff here is the original silicate melt. And now what you notice if you look at this really closely is that you've got some little domains where you've got all olivine and sulfide, and then you've got other little domains where you've got all olivine and silicate. So this is now silicate melt sitting in between the original olivine crystals. And in these silicate-rich areas, there's very little sulfide, and in these sulfide areas, there's very little silicate. In other words, the rock seems to be dividing itself up into domains that are sulfide-rich and silicate-rich. Now it turns out we then started looking at lots of other ore deposits, and we found that this was actually a really common thing. So these are some disseminated to net textured ores from very important ore deposits in China. Jinchuan, one of the biggest nickel deposits in the world. And pretty much all of the Jinchuan ore looks like this, and I've done the same thing here again. I've just broken out the different components so you can see them. So here the olivine crystals are in black, the sulfides in red, silicate liquid, and that's now actually mostly orthoproxene, clinoproxene, and plagioclase. That now shows up in green. And again, here you see you've got sulfide-rich domains, you've got silicate-rich domains. And then over here, this is another sample. This is from Nova. That's a deposit we'll talk about a bit more later on. Exactly the same thing. The olivine's in black, the sulfide is in red, and the blue and green are different pyroxenes. And here again, the sulfide is forming these little kind of channelways. And within these little sulfide channelways, there's no silicate melt. Outside them, there's no sulfide. In other words, the rock seems to during the process of solidifying, the rock's actually separated out into these sulfide-rich and silicate-rich domains. And here's one more example of that. This is also from Jinchuan. And this is a sample that's only got about 3 or 4% sulfide in it. Again, the olivine is in green. The grey material is the interstitial silicate melt, now solidified to pyroxene and plagioclase. That's what it looks like in 3D. So even though there's only a few percent sulfide in this rock, you'll see that those sulfides actually link together to form these frameworks. The different colours here are just different interconnected frameworks within the rock. And these frameworks are sort of several centimeters in size. So what's going on? Well, what's driving this? So now let's go back to the physics again. What's driving this is this reaction, this interplay between the surface tension effects, which govern whether the sulfide can or can't wet the olivine, and the gravitational force. So here we've got just a little sort of simple diagram. The green represents olivine, the red represents sulfide droplets, and the white is silicate melt. So here's a little sulfide droplet sitting in an interstitial pocket in between what we call the pores in between the olivine crystals. Now that sulfide droplet, you remember I said earlier on, the sulfide liquid is really dense, so it actually wants to try and migrate downwards. It wants to try and fall to the bottom of the stack. So there's a gravitational force acting on the droplet that's trying to make that happen. But also, we've got a capillary force, that's the surface tension force, and that surface tension force is trying to keep that droplet spherical. It's trying to stop it from deforming. Now, remember that in the case where we've got silicate melt here between the olivines, that sulfide liquid doesn't want to stick to the surface of the olivine grains. It wants to stay as a discrete droplet and not actually wet the surface of those crystals. So that's the other thing that kind of underpins this one. So we've now got surface tension force, which is acting upwards. It's resisting the tendency of the sulfide to try and percolate down through the pore space. And we've also got a gravitational force that's driving percolation through that pore space. So what that's going to try and do is it's going to deform that sulfide droplet and make it kind of squeeze through the gap. Now, normally, if the sulfide droplet's quite small, it can't do that. But if you get enough sulfide together, in other words, if you can link enough of these things together so that you've actually got a little bit of pressure driving that sulfide droplet, then effectively this is like having a kind of a hydrostatic head at the bottom of that little interconnected sulfide domain. That sulfide has now got enough density, it's got enough gravitational force that can overcome the capillary force and actually start to migrate through the pore space of the rocks. So we, along with a couple of my colleagues, Margot Levaillant at CSIRO and Anya Slim at Monash, we decided to try and make some analog models of this and see if we could actually make this happen in the lab. And Anya came up with a nice combination of materials that we could use. So we're using salt water to simulate the liquid sulfides, and that's we're using olive oil to simulate the silicate melt, and we're using little round plastic beads to simulate the olivine. And in this case, the olive oil wets the beads, but the water doesn't. And also the salt water is much denser than the olive oil, so it wants to try and sink. So this is a nice little sort of setup for our model. And then here's how we did the experiments. Just mixed up these various components in different ways inside glass beakers. This is what the setup looks like, and then you can just basically sort of set it up and let it run. One of the things we had to watch out for, and this is just a little sort of story about how careful you have to be when you're doing experiments, that you're not introducing other effects that are going to fool you. And one of the things that can happen in these kinds of experiments is because you've got everything that's happening inside a glass beaker, the liquids involved can actually also interact with the glass beaker. and because you're only seeing the liquids which are actually contact with the edge of it, then you've got to be careful that's not kind of dominating what you're actually seeing, and you might be fooling yourself into observing something that's not really happening. So to get around that, we did these experiments inside a CAT scanner, originally inside a medical CT scanner that we've got at CSIRO, and then we did another batch of experiments at the synchrotron in Melbourne, across the road from Monash, and I'll just jump straight through to some of the results. So this is a 3D image that we made at the synchrotron, so you can and we've highlighted here. This is the sulfide liquid, or the salt water really, but we're pretending it's sulfide liquid, and we're starting out with a little layer of it. And what's happening with time is that that sulfide liquid is actually starting to form these little pathways and chains which percolate down through the sulfide and end up accumulating at the bottom of the beaker. And that's just a 2D sort of snapshot of what one of these experiments looked like in the middle. There's the sulfide droplets at the top, and here are the sulfides forming these little interconnected pathways draining all the way down to the bottom. And here's our natural sample from Jinchuan, so you can see what it is that we're trying to emulate. And I think you'll agree that actually they've come up looking pretty similar to the natural textures. So on the basis of that, this is what we think is going on. We think that in the case of the Alexo ores particularly, remember Alexo, we had these different sulfide-rich and sulfide-poor domains. We also had these little big sort of sulfide globules that were sitting in the rock. We think that we're starting out with something that looks like this. Then on top of this, we're adding more sulfide, and that sulfide, there's enough of it that it actually starts to interconnect and start to form these pathways and little channelways. And as those little channelways migrate through the rock, they push the silicate liquid out of the way. Now, remember, if you push the silicate liquid out of the way, now the sulfide liquid can quite happily wet the olivine, because it's only the silicate liquid there that's stopping it. So once you've got these little sulfide-rich domains, the sulfide can now happily migrate through those pathways, just like we saw in our experiments. So we've got a feedback process that's now operating. The longer the sulfide pathways get, the more sulfide liquid can move through them, which helps sulfide pathways to get longer and so on, until eventually, if everything goes in your favor, you can actually end up with the sulfide completely flooding through the rock and pushing the silicate melt out altogether. So that would give rise to some of our really sort of clean, pure, net textured ores, but most of the time what we get is something like this. We get these so-called patchy net textured or patchy disseminated ores, where the sulfide liquids push the silicate melt out of the way through most of the rock, but not completely. And where this happens in nature, we find these kinds of combinations of textures. So this is some drill core from a sulfide deposit in Canada, and this is a very typical sort of situation where we actually get a mixture of all sorts of different sulfide textures in the rock, just depending on to what extent this sulfide drainage process has actually been able to get going and create these pockets of. Now what I want to show you is a special case of sulfides percolating through originally solid rock, pushing all the silicate out of the way and making these very, very spectacular kind of textures. These things are called Spinifex ores, and we find these in quite rarely, but quite significant in a number of different komatiite deposits, particularly around the Kambalda area. And this is a cross-section through a typical Kambalda ore body. And the lower part of it here is typically what most of these komatiite-looking ores, komatiite-associated ores at Kambalda look like. They're sitting at the bottom of thick parts of komatiite flows, and the sulfide ores sit down on these basal contacts, typically in these sort of trough-like features within the underlying basalt. Now, I won't go into any of the details of that, but where we get Spinifex ores is where we get a slightly different situation, where we get sulfide developed actually sitting on top of a pre-existing komatiite flow. And there are a few places where this happens, where that does happen, some really interesting textures develop. And this is what they look like. So this is one of these so-called hanging wall ore situations. That's a komatiite flow underneath. That's the host komatiite flow above. This is the massive sulfide. And the Spinifex ore sits in this little zone in here. And what's going on here is that the sulfide has displaced all of the original silicate component out of the Spinifex zone of the komatiite flow. And the Spinifex zone is where the olivine, instead of being little sort of round, rice grain type crystals that we've seen in our examples so far, in the Spinifex zone, the olivine forms these great big enormous plate-shaped crystals which grow down from the top of the flow And what's happened here is the sulfide's actually pushed all of the silicate melt out between them. It's left those olivine crystals there because the olivine crystals are really refractory, very high melting point. They can't melt, they just sit there. And what you see here, these little blobs up here, these are the blobs of the silicate melt that's actually been displaced from in between the olivine grains. And here's a close-up of one of these that we studied from the coronet ore body at Kambalda. That's an XRF map. And what you can see there, the sulfide in this particular image, this is another one of these XRF images. The sulfide shows up in these turquoisey colors. The olivine and the silicate component show up in different shades of blue. And these are the olivine plates here that you can see from these little sort of fans of sheets of olivine growing down from the top. And the sulfide's percolated in between them. And this sort of purple stuff here, this is the silicate melt that's been pushed out from between the olivine grains, flows back up along the edge of the Spinifex grains and accumulates at the top, and then eventually floats up into the sulfide. So this is a beautiful sort of smoking gun for how sulfide melt has such incredible properties to actually carry heat into the rocks around it, that it can actually melt komatiite. Now bear in mind that komatiite, this is a very, very high temperature magma, so these rocks originally crystallized at temperatures around about 1600 centigrade. So, and that's how hot the sulfide was when it came in. But the sulfide's actually able to remelt that material and actually push it out of the way to form these little sort of blobs and plumes of silicate melt that then float up into the sulfide. So that's a good point, just to remind you of this sort of essential feature. Sulfide liquids are very dense and very runny, and very high heat capacity, and all of that together means that they're very, very efficient carriers of heat. So that gives rise to this sort of hot knife through butter analogy. And they're going to be coming back into that. In fact, we're going straight into it now, talking about what happens when sulfides interact in some circumstances with the rocks underneath them. So when rocks accumulate at the bottom of an igneous body and come into contact with sedimentary or metamorphic or whatever country rocks underneath, then they can interact with those rocks as well in really interesting ways. And that's what we're going to be talking about now, in the formation of what I'm going to call sulfide silicate infiltration melting fronts. And here's a beautiful example of one. So we're back in komatiite land again now. And this is a level plan from the Silver Swan mine near Kalgoorlie in Western Australia, that's about 5 meters of scale. Oh, sorry, no, it's not 10 meters. There's the scale. That's 10 meters. This is a very, very thick body of massive sulfide sitting at the bottom of a komatiite flow, which is shown here in purple. Everything's dipping vertically, so we're just looking down on a plan. So you're looking at basically sort of an original cross section through the flow. And this little zone here, you can see these little sort of yellow blobs inside the red. What they indicate is what I'm about to show you, and that is a zone where the rocks underneath the komatiite are actually melting and forming little plumes and blobs within the komatiite flow. Now, important to notice here that the rocks underneath the komatiite here, in this particular locality, at Kambalda they're basalts, but here they're not, they're dacites. So these are rocks with a much lower melting point. And in fact, what's happened is that the sulfide is so hot that it's actually given rise to wholesale melting of this dacite along this basal contact. And the consequence of that is that the sulfides actually run down through cracks and filled little and generated a little sort of vein array down here within the dacite, but also the dacite has peeled off and floated up into the komatiite. And what's driving this is simply that the density of this dacite, which is now partially molten material, is much less than that of the sulfide, so it's got a really strong tendency to float up into the sulfide. And here's what those dacite plumes look like in detail, these very irregular, curvy sorts of morphologies. It's basically just a disaggregating melt. They're a little bit like the way raindrops rip themselves apart when they fall. They're being ripped apart by the shear in the sulfide melt around them and generating these very complicated sort of toffee morphologies. And it's very typical of what we see in these kinds of textures. We'll see some more of those as we go along. So going back to Kambalda again now, and here's a really nice example of one of these infiltration melting fronts. In this case, this is a komatiite sulfide ore body sitting on top of basalt. And this is from a paper I wrote with Sebastian Stauder a few years ago. This is the Moran ore body. The scale bar there is 100 meters. I'll get my laser pointer back. The scale bar there is 100 meters. That's the basal flow. There's the sulfide ore body, and it forms these little things called pinch outs, which extend out into the basalt underneath. Now let's have a look at some of the textures we see right along that bottom contact. And what we get are these beautiful little plumes of basalt, just a few centimeters in size. This is molten basalt, just like we saw with the dacite. This is molten basalt that's now trying to float up into the sulfide. But another interesting thing happens here, that where we had these two liquids in contact, the basalt liquid and the sulfide liquid, they react with one another and they form chromite. And that's what these little red things are here. They're beautiful little skeletal chromite crystals. You can see in the middle image there, that's another XRF map where chromium is in red, so the chromite shows up as red, and the sulfide shows up as green. And the blue material there are little sort of wisps and wafts and plumes of molten basalt that are trying to float up into the sulfide. These zones extend up to a few tens of centimeters down below the bottom of the sulfide ore body. This is another XRF scan of a piece of drill core showing that the sulfide is basically filling cracks in the underlying basalt. But right at the top of the basalt, the presence of the chromite there, which you can see in red, the presence of the chromite there shows you where the basalt is melting. Where there's no chromite, the basalt's not melting. That's just basically sulfide filling fractures. So what we think is happening is that the sulfide is getting emplaced on top of this basalt substrate. The basalt's got lots of cracks in it and lots of hydrothermal alteration from a long period sitting on the seafloor before the komatiites came along. The sulfide starts to percolate into those cracks, and up near the top it's hot enough that it actually starts to melt the basalt. And as this process goes along, the cracks get bigger and more interconnected. And so what we actually end up with is a breccia. We end up with which is partially molten at the top, but what we call a sulfide matrix breccia at the bottom, where the sulfide is just filling brittle fractures within the footwall basalt. And we'll see that this kind of texture actually turns up in quite a few different places at different scales, depending on what pretty much what the identity of the footwall rock is. And again, there's a feedback mechanism operating here, because the further the sulfide penetrates down into the basalt, the greater the differential pressure is at the tip of these little fractures. So the stronger the tendency is for the sulfide to keep propagating and keep driving its way down through the basalt. So the sulfide's going to keep propagating its way down, and how far these fractures go depends on how far they can go before they freeze. So there's basically a race between the tendency of the sulfide to push its way through the cracks versus the tendency of the sulfide to lose heat to the country rocks and freeze up. And depending on the balance between those two things, you'll get a bigger or a larger infiltration front. And as I'll show you right at the end when I talk about nova, these fronts can actually get to be really big. So now here's another place where we see this kind of process operating. This is a cartoon of one of the intrusive bodies, which hosts some of the world's most valuable ore bodies and some of the world's largest nickel copper PGE sulfide ore bodies. And this is a place called Norilsk, which is in central Siberia, far northern Siberia, but well inside the Arctic Circle. These are very, very famous and very, very spectacular ore bodies. And one of the features that they show is the beautiful development of infiltration melting fronts down at the bottom, where they're in contact with sedimentary country rocks. So let's have a look at that in a little bit more detail. This is the base of one of these ore bodies. Sulfide here in the goldy colors, and this material down here is an argillite. It's basically a shale. And the sulfide is penetrating along the foliation or the bedding of the shale, and bits of it are peeling away. So it's just like what we saw with the dacite at Silver Swan, and in this case it's a sedimentary rock. And you see these very sort of irregular, complicated shapes around the edge. So what's happening here? This is where the shale is actually melting. Another interesting thing to notice here is that this this interval of xenolith-rich sulfide actually only occurs within a few meters of the contact. Whenever you get these things, if the sulfide is thick enough, as it is in a few of these cases, if you get more than sort of 2 or 3 meters away from the contact, you have absolutely pure sulfide, and all of the silicate inclusions have gone. Now, what's the reason for that? Well, I think the reason is that as soon as these silicate inclusions detach themselves and break away, it's then like trying to hold a cork underwater. They're extremely buoyant. They don't stay put. They float very, very quickly to the top of the sulfide. And in some cases, one very nice example at Cambalda, we can actually find them at the top of the sulfide ore body. We can find kind of a scum of stuff that started out at the bottom, melted and floated up and accumulated at the top. Here at Norilsk, I don't know if anybody's ever seen that. It may be there. Maybe nobody's looked for it. But we definitely see these kinds of features well developed along the bottom contacts. So there's the sulfide percolating through, driving its way along the bedding in the footwall, and then this detached lumps of partly molten footwall trying to float away. And if we look at the textures that we see in the ores in detail, so this is a piece of drill core from one of these kinds of contacts, what we see again, these really sort of irregular, sort of toffee, sticky, blobby lumps of silicate, which have melted. So in this case, this is a shale which has melted and now re-solidified to form what's basically a granite, forming these irregular blobs sitting within the sulfide. And now these things are commonly called breccias, but they're really not breccias. A breccia is where you have a fragment of one rock that's broken up and incorporated into another. These aren't fragments. These are actually, this is molten rock. So what we've got here is actually a mixture of two immiscible liquids partially stirred together by this gravity-driven process at the bottom of the ore body. So, and the name for a mixture of two liquids is an emulsion. So we call these things emulsion textures, and they're very widespread in lots of different magmatic sulfide deposits. So we'll set a little sort of thinking exercise for you here, and that's to think about the different kinds of emulsion that you can get. And there's a very nice analog to some of the textures that we see in ore deposits, is to think about it in terms of salad dressing or mayonnaise, and salad dressing or vinaigrette. Now, so your standard sort of salad dressing, your oil and vinegar salad dressing, is where you have oil droplets in water. That is to say, you've got droplets of the lighter liquid sitting in the heavier one, and that's what a typical vinaigrette dressing looks like if you look at it close up. Mayonnaise is actually the other way around. A mayonnaise forms when you've actually got water droplets sitting in oil, so you've actually got the denser liquid sitting inside the lighter one. If we're going to make an analog for our ore deposits, for some of the emulsion textures that we see in sulfide ores, then perhaps we can use this as a sort of analog, because in fact we find both. So I'll just leave this to you for an exercise to think about. So here's a couple of different emulsion textures. In one of them you've got massive sulfide blobs sitting in a matrix of silicate melt. So that's an emulsion with sulfide in silicate. Here you've got, this is the one we just saw, this is the Norilsk example, this is blobs of silicate melt sort of sitting in a matrix of sulfide. So one of these is mayonnaise and one of them is vinaigrette. So I'll leave it to you to work out which one's which. Right, so now I want to go and take a little bit of a detour. We've been talking about textures which are a result of the wetting and melting capability of sulfide as it percolates through silicate rocks or silicate crystal mushes. But I just want to have a look now at another particular category of disseminated ores, which show up in a lot of different ore deposits. And these are what we call globular disseminated ores. So in fact, I showed you one of these right at the beginning. You'll remember when we were talking about sulfide wetting, I showed you an example of where you have globules of sulfide, little round blobs of sulfide, isolated from one another, sitting in a matrix of silicate crystals and silicate melt. That's one of the types of globular disseminated ores. But in fact, it turns out that there are a few others. So let's have a look and see what some of the variations are. And this is one variation, and this is a very important, very common ore type which is found in the Sudbury ore deposits in Canada. And you would have heard in your sort of introductory lecture to magmatic sulfides that the ores at Sudbury formed as a result of a cataclysmic meteorite impact, which melted a big chunk of the crust, and that included a fair bit of sulfide, and the sulfide then accumulated at the bottom of a gigantic melt sheet. I don't really have time to go into too much of the ins and outs of where this particular sample came from, but this is a particularly common texture you see at Sudbury, where you've got these quite irregular, sort of funny-looking globules of sulfide sitting in a matrix of silicate. And in this case, this is what at Sudbury is called the quartz diorite. It's basically a dacite composition. So it's quite a silica-rich rock. This is the host magma to the Sudbury ore deposits. It's not a mafic rock. It's an intermediate rock. It's a dacite with about 60-odd% silica, and it typically has these irregular kind of sulfide blobs in it. This is an XRF image of them. So you can see in this particular image, the sulfides are in black and the silicates are in multiple colors. So that's basically feldspar and amphibole. And the image on the right there, that's another image that shows the sulfide minerals, and in that case the pyrrhotite, pentanodite, and chalcopyrite, which make up the sulfide components. I don't have time to go into this in detail, but I just want to make one point, which is actually the composition of these different sulfide globules actually varies quite a lot. Some of them are quite copper rich, some of them are quite nickel rich, some of them have lots of pentanodite, some of them have not very much. So I've got those there twice. One of the other factors to consider here, the reason why we're actually making this particular type of globular ore at Sudbury, why it's so common at Sudbury, has got to do with the different melting temperatures of the silicate and sulfide component. So, this diagram here, this is from one of my papers from 2016. This shows you the melting ranges of different types of material. So in purple here, this is komatiite. And komatiite starts to crystallize at about 1600 degrees, and it's solid by around about 1100. These are basalts at different pressures. This is basalt. This is dry basalt with not much water in it. If you have a wet basalt, like an island arc basalt, might have anywhere up to about 4% water in it. That's the light green color there. Then again, at different pressures, it'll have a much lower melting temperature. Now on the right-hand side there, those brown bars show sulfide. Copper poor sulfide, there's not very much copper in the ore. The copper poor sulfide starts to crystallize about 1100 degrees, and it's solid by about 1050. If it's a copper-rich sulfide, again it starts to crystallize about 1100. It solidifies all the way down to about 800. Now here's the melting range for a Sudbury dacite. So in other words, at Sudbury, unlike sulfides and komatiites, and unlike sulfides and a lot of basalts, at Sudbury the sulfide actually starts to crystallize before the silicate does. So that's why we get these complicated sulfide globular textures here, because these things were already solid while the silicate around them was still mostly molten. So that's a very particular case of a sulfide texture. Now we also find these kinds of textures in deposits that we think formed from island arc type magmas, which were mafic magmas, but mafic magmas had a lot of dissolved water in them, and that the effect of having all that water in them means that they crystallized at a lower temperature and over a much wider melting range than usual. So the basalt starts to solidify before the sulfide does. And perhaps what we're seeing in the Sudbury, these particular Sudbury globular ores, is they might have actually already solidified previously, and then been kind of ripped up and re-entrained and travel and carried further downstream. That's really a story for another day. Now let's move on to another kind of globular disseminated ore, and this is a really interesting variety, and we're going back to Norilsk again. So here again is a cartoon of our Norilsk intrusion. These are big tube-shaped sills, and most of the sulfide accumulates down sort of near the bottom. A large proportion of the sulfide in these intrusions actually is in the form of globular ores, and here's some pictures of some very typical Norilsk globular ores. They're typically these flattened sort of oblate kind of spherical globules. Typically the smaller ones are a bit more spherical, the bigger ones are a bit more flattened. They're very often internally differentiated, so they're copper rich at the top and nickel rich at the bottom, and that's a story for another day. But what's really interesting about them is when we look at them very, very closely, you find out that they're associated with these things that we call silicate caps. And I'll show you in a little bit more detail what those are. So here's a beautiful sample of a Norilsk globular ore, and we'll just zoom in on one of these little globules. Now you can, there's the sulfide showing up in the sort of brassy colours, the silicate and the grey colours, and you can see around the top of the sulfide there's a sort of a black zone, and if we look at that's an XRF image of that, where we can see the mineralogy more clearly. That's the internal differentiation of the sulfide, and the dark material around the top of the copper-rich bit, the orange stuff there. That's this silicate cap. What are these silicate caps? Well, here's another image. This is another XRF image. This is actually collected at the Australian synchrotron. And here you can see the bottom image shows you the sulfide mineralogy, the top image shows you the silicate mineralogy, and the sulfides are in these sort of yellowy green colors. And you can see around both of these big ones, the big one on the left and the big one on the bottom right, that the sulfides are actually sitting in these sort of holes within this framework of olivine crystals. And sitting on top of them is a little gap that's filled in by the intercumulus minerals, the interstitial minerals that are crystallizing from the trap melt in between the olivine grains. So that's just emphasizing the olivine crystals there in green. So you can see how the sulfides are sitting inside these sort of semi-circular, sort of semi-spherical holes in this framework of olivine crystals. Let's have a look at that one in a bit more detail. That shows you really clearly this sulfide mineralogy. The blue stuff down the bottom is pyrrhotite and pentlandite, and the green is chalcopyrite. This is one big crystal, big single crystal of pyrrhotite that the pentlandite is exolved from. And here's this silicate cap sitting on top of it all. So what are these things? Well, this is where I'm going to introduce you to the concept of the drobble. And this is going back to some experimental work which was done in quite a few years ago now by our colleague now at Carleton University, Jim Mungall. And Jim had been doing lots of experiments on sulfide liquids, looking at geochemistry of sulfide liquids mostly. But in many of his experiments, inside these are high temperature experiments done in a high temperature furnace at about 1100, 1200 degrees. And in a lot of these experiments, as well as having a silicate melt, which is the light grey stuff there, and a sulfide melt, which is the white stuff, he also had gas bubbles. And it turned out that whenever you had both of them in the same experiment, the sulfide liquid would attach itself to the gas bubble. And what you're looking at here, this is the blue and yellow there. These are actually microtomography 3D images of sulfide droplets attached to gas bubbles. And we've repeated this many times now, and there's no doubt that this is a very, very strong association. So whenever you've got a vapor phase exolving from a magma, sort of magma is vesiculating and generating a vapor phase, if there's sulfide in there as well, the sulfide will stick to the vapor phase. So that's how we think that some of these globular ores, some maybe all of the globular ores that Norilsk formed, is that they started out as sulfide carried in the magma, not just purely as a sulfide droplet, but as sulfide droplets attached to gas bubbles. And these things then get incorporated into an olivine cumulus at the bottom. So this is just a representation of that. The green is the olivine, and the grey and red things there are these composite bubble drobbles that accumulate in the crystal pile, and then subsequent process leads to this sort of gas cap, this vapor cap here, getting infilled by silicate minerals. And that's a fairly complicated process that I don't have time to go into. We wrote a paper on this a couple of years ago, which you can follow up on if you're interested. But that's the story of the Norilsk drobbles. And the story goes a little bit further than that, in that, again, I don't have time to go into this, but I'll just point you to a couple of publications that deal with it. During the course of this process, if you have sulfide droplets attached to gas bubbles and they float up decompress, then what happens is the gas bubbles get bigger and bigger, and the sulfide droplets will actually start to degas, and a lot of the sulfur and quite likely some of the metals also actually partition into the vapor phase. So you end up with a vapor phase which has got copper and gold and potentially some nickel in it as well. And this can then escape and vent out into the atmosphere. We've speculated that this is a paper that we published a few years ago now, where we speculated that this might actually be part of the story of the great, the biggest mass extinction in Earth history, which happened at the boundary between the Permo-Triassic and at exactly the same age, precisely within less than 1 million years of as closely as can be measured, to the age of the Norilsk sulfide ore bodies. So this process seems to have actually not only formed some of the world's most valuable ore bodies, but also seems to have been a real pivotal event in the history of life on the planet. So that's a paper you're welcome to have a look at if you're interested. So at this point, I'm going to sort of break this up and call this the end of the first lecture. And then in the sort of the second part of this, I'm going to be developing some of these ideas and also talking about a very common type of ore that we find at a lot of sulfide-rich ore deposits, the breccia ores, and how they form and what they mean. So I will leave you here at the end of lecture 1.